Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. It's been a while since I've done an episode of utterly pointless comparisons, so I figured it was time. And today I'll be taking a look at the arcade and Super Nintendo ports of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. This was the second Turtles game to be released into the arcades, and the fourth one to be released onto home consoles, and it's named accordingly on each platform. Konami released Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, Turtles in Time, into the arcades in March of 1991. It was part of a long-running series of 4-player beat-em-ups that dated back to their own game Crime Fighters from 1989. Turtles 2 also arrived at pretty much the exact same time as another famous Konami 4-player beat-em-up, The Simpsons arcade game. So Turtles in Time didn't exactly add a whole lot new to the mix that wasn't in, say, even the first Turtles game, but it did refine the gameplay a little bit, the graphics were a little nicer, and the sound was a little bit improved. It also added the awesome smash move that everybody loves so much. It was a great game, and it was a lot of fun with 3 or 4 players. Now Konami knew they were sitting on a gold mine with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles license, so they really needed to get that game ported to a home system. And they took their time, but they did get it released to the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom in the US and in Japan in the summer of 1992, and it came along a little bit later in the fall of 92 in Europe. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time, for the Super Nintendo, was a really great port of the arcade game. It's not perfect, it's only 2 players instead of 4, it's got a lot less things on screen at once, but it was a fantastic arcade port, and frankly it stands as one of the best action arcade ports to the platform in its entire lifetime. Now it had the unfortunate timing to be released at roughly the same time as Street Fighter II, so it was kind of eclipsed by that game when it came out initially. TMNT 4 Turtles in Time didn't even win EGM's Game of the Month award, because it was won by Street Fighter II in the very same issue. Alright, recording methodology. I kept it pretty simple here. I used a few save states here and there just to make sure I could keep the games in sync as closely as possible. I did edit out some few seconds of just black screen from the Super Nintendo game in between when the level is introduced and it starts, also to help keep it in sync better with the arcade release. And I've got a surprise game thrown into the mix for a section where there's no equivalent in the arcade version, where some new stuff was added to the Super Nintendo. Alright then, let's get on with it. To kick things off, obviously the arcade game has a HUD that supports 4 players instead of 2 like on SNES. At first glance, Konami did a great job at bringing the look of Turtles in Time to the SNES. In fact, no matter how many glances you take, they did a pretty great job. The only real noticeable visual letdowns are that the arcade game has way more animation on its sprites and way more of them on screen at once. The arcade game can have up to 8 foot soldiers on screen at once, plus some extra stuff, while the SNES version typically only has up to 4 plus some extra stuff. Now I will say that it's a little bit easier to get through some parts of the Super Nintendo game faster than the arcade original because of the different enemy placement and the fact that it contains fewer enemies. The colors are also slightly more muted in the arcade game and higher contrast on Super Nintendo, which is to be expected since that's true of nearly all arcade ports to nearly any home console. But as we go on, you'll see that in this case, the colors between the 2 games are often very close. And I've also got to say that Konami really nailed the music in the SNES port. I'm sure many of you aren't surprised by this, but I was back in the day because arcade ports to the SNES often featured drab, lifeless samples that sounded worse than the FM sound chips used in the arcade games, which in many ways were technically inferior. Konami crafted some of the best quality music you'd ever hear on either the NES or SNES, and they really stood head and shoulders above most other companies. Yeah, the arcade bosses are tougher than the SNES bosses, probably mostly because that version was meant for 4 players. Baxterfly here also has a bit of a different attack pattern between the 2 games. He's not radically different, but in what will become an ongoing theme, he's a bit more aggressive, and there seems to be a little bit more randomness to his movements in the original arcade game versus the SNES port. Yeah, so here you're seeing in real time how much more punishment the bosses take in the arcade version of Turtles in Time. Honestly, it can kinda make playing through it on one player a bit annoying. I mean, I guess it's not too bad when you get used to it, but it still takes longer than it feels like it should. I'll be done with them soon here, don't worry. As Stage 2 starts, your turtle jumps in from the top of the screen in the arcade game and the side of the screen on SNES. Oddly enough, in this section of the level, the blacks are deeper in the arcade version than they are in the home version. Another thing worth mentioning here is that the arcade game uses a fair amount of voice samples, nearly all of which are missing from the SNES port of Turtles in Time. The SNES mainly just has a couple of quick turtle clips for specific situations, cutting pretty much all the enemy dialogue and replacing it with plain text. And we've got way more enemies in the arcade in this section. You'll also notice they have a lot of different types of animation for jumping and sometimes even just walking that are totally absent from the home game. Also in the Super Nintendo port, it's missing the graffiti on the walls that we'll see just in the arcade game here. Now the arcade version of Turtles in Time has these weird little clownish robots on treads that fire boxing gloves at you. They are totally missing from the Super Nintendo version. On the SNES, those robots are replaced with some of the standard small ones that fire lasers. You may have already noticed, but the pizza boxes look a little different between the 2 games too. In the arcade version, you have the pizza box with a heart above it, and it animates and we sometimes see the word pizza. These are the ones that restore your life. On SNES, we just see a box with the word pizza on it and there's no heart. Later, when you get your special attack, you'll see there's a little bomb above the pizza box in the arcade version that's not there on Super Nintendo. I'll also note here that when it comes to gameplay, well, I think that the SNES game is actually superior to the arcade original. It just feels tighter and much more refined. It's much easier to throw enemies or get them into that slamming animation than on the arcade version, for example. Alright, as we get into the boss fight here, we've got the same boss in both versions, but his behavior is simpler on the Super Nintendo. Sticklers will notice that the backgrounds are a little different here. The arcade one has these wooden planks covering the hole in the upper right corner. Most of the fencing and signs and stuff are wider on SNES. Also, the arcade version has some diagonal boards and an empty window that are missing on Super Nintendo. I'll also say that I appreciate that Konami added the boss name and a health meter to the home port. I do kind of miss the lightning zaps from the arcade game that show up when you hit robotic enemies, since those are missing from the SNES game, but you can clearly see that Turtles in Time is a top quality arcade port to SNES, even if it's not quite perfect. Yeesh, how much punishment can Metalhead take? He's going to be finished off in the arcade version first, and then he'll follow shortly after on the Super Nintendo. And then we get on to a stage that's a little different between the two games, and I'll explain that in just a moment. Alright, as we enter Stage 3, you'll notice that things diverge a bit here. The arcade has this large wall of spikes that crashes down on your head that's missing from the SNES. Or at least, it's missing from this part of the stage. We'll see it a little bit later on SNES. Also, in the arcade original, this is kind of a normal stage with enemies that take multiple hits to kill. The only real difference between this and other stages is the fact that you're riding on a platform instead of running around. On Super Nintendo, when the stage begins, it's clearly introduced as a bonus stage. In that version of the game, enemies only take one hit to kill, and there are lots of bonus pieces to pick up. A few other things about this stage. The layout is obviously a little different as far as enemy placement goes. Konami also slightly extended the amount of vertical space that you have to move around in the SNES version compared to the arcade original. And the pizza monster creatures are a little bigger in the arcade game too. And of course, the arcade version often has more enemies on screen at once. Anyway, once you finish the main area on the SNES, it tallies up your bonus points for you, something that doesn't happen in the arcade original since it's not considered a bonus area. Once the bonus points are distributed, you'll go on for a moment of just complete emptiness before reaching a boss fight that's unique to that version, the Rat King. In the arcade version, there's actually no boss fight on this level. You just fight a bunch of pizza monsters and then Shredder sends you back into the past. One thing I will note is that you don't see me much use the special attack in this game that occurs when you press the attack and jump buttons simultaneously. In Turtles in Time, using that move drains your health when it strikes an enemy. In the original arcade game, your A and B attack didn't. And I found that the move was pretty much useless in this version, so you won't really ever see me use it. I think I might have done it a few times in the arcade games just to check it out. Aside from that, on SNES, they actually added a brand new level after this one, which you're about to see, so we'll talk about that shortly. Okay, and here I am contending with an awful lot of pizza monsters. Really, it's kind of weird they didn't add a boss fight into this level in the arcade version. This just feels like sort of a weird anticlimactic way to end a level. I'm kind of glad that they jazzed it up a bit on the Super Nintendo. I'll also add that in the SNES version of the game, the level scrolls by a little faster too.
My patience is wearing thin. I'm banishing you to a time warp from which you will never return.
Alright, on Super Nintendo, like I said here, we've got a brand new level, so I'm going to need to show you something in place of the arcade game for a while to keep this interesting. I know, have a look at HyperStone Heist for the Genesis. If you didn't know, this game uses the same engine as Turtles in Time and a bunch of the same assets. It has some different level layouts, including a few exclusive ones, and there are also fewer bosses. On Super Nintendo, we're in the Technodrome here in present day. The first part of the level is pretty standard. Then it goes into an elevator scene, which is also pretty standard for the genre, which leads to a boss fight with Toka and Razar. In the arcade game, these two are bosses of a later level. So there are a few boss differences between the Super Nintendo and arcade games from this point on, but not many. And the final bit of this level sort of borrows a boss fight from Battletoads. You'll see what I mean. So on Genesis, you've been looking at snippets from throughout the game. You haven't really heard it yet though, have you? Well, listen now. Pretty impressive, isn't it? Konami did an absolutely awesome job on the music and sound in this game. Now the visuals in HyperStone Heist are a slight step down from both the SNES and arcade Turtles in Time. HyperStone Heist has less color, and the energy bars are on a black border on top of the screen instead of on an overlay in front of the background, something that was really common for Konami games on the system. Other than those differences, it looks pretty close to both the other versions. As far as gameplay goes, I'd say that HyperStone Heist is even a little more refined than the SNES version of Turtles in Time. It's just super fast and fluid. Slamming enemies now happens 3 times no matter how much health they have left, and hitting another enemy with them while slamming one doesn't automatically kill it anymore. The only real problem with this gameplay-wise is that it's got shorter areas and fewer boss encounters. There's also a couple of bosses recycled from the first game that feel just a smidge out of place. HyperStone Heist is still great and close to the other 2 versions, and I've got to say that overall, it's just the smallest step behind them. Okay, let's jump back to the SNES Turtles in Time for a moment here. So fans of the first TMNT arcade game may be wondering if the Technodrome on the SNES game is based on that level from the original arcade game. While it does have a few similarities, I'd say it's primarily a new design that has a few callbacks to the original. The second section with the elevator is completely different from the short elevator section in the original game, in which you had to avoid giant metal bouncy balls as you rode the elevator diagonally down towards a lower floor. Now this is still the Technodrome, so it doesn't look radically different in the 2 games, but you can still tell it's a new design if you compare it to the first arcade game. Now back over to HyperStone Heist, you've seen the levels based in Japan, which are quite different from any other version of TMNT. Personally, I think the inner dojo is a bit more of an interesting area than the outside garden section. Now the boss of this level is Tatsu from the second Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. He's especially annoying because you have to fight him while regular foot soldiers try to attack you from behind. Then HyperStone Heist commits the sin of having a boss rush section in the very next level. I mean, there's only been 3 bosses in the whole game at this point, so having to fight them all again right now, right after fighting the 3rd one, is kind of annoying. And then it ends with a version of Baxter Stockman's boss that most resembles the boss fight from the original Turtles arcade game. After that, you go on to the final section, which is similar to the Starbase level from Turtles in Time, and you fight Super Krang as the boss in the first section. Then you do a level similar to the Technodrome elevator from the SNES Turtles in Time before fighting the final boss, which is Super Shredder. Now let's play what I would have liked to have seen from HyperStone Heist. If they wanted to make it more unique, I think it would have been nice if it was more of a mix of both of the arcade games. Those bosses from the first arcade game would have worked better, perhaps, in levels from the first arcade game. I think they should have grabbed 3 or 4 areas from the first Turtles game, and then mixed it in with 3 or 4 areas from Turtles in Time, and then threw in a couple of new levels on top of that. But anyway, what do I know? Let's get back to the arcade game now.
Prehistoric Turtlesaurus.
I don't know what it is, but it seems like Konami put less effort into this level than the prior ones. The background colors are way off, and the trees look a lot simpler on SNES when compared to the arcade original. Also, those trees in the foreground are in a separate scrolling layer in the arcade game. Meanwhile, in the Super Nintendo version, they're on the same static layer as the main background, which is a long-winded way of saying they removed the parallax scrolling on that layer. The dinosaurs we see in both versions behave a lot differently. In the arcade game, the land-based ones that sort of look like raptors, they're just mounts for foot soldiers. While they do show up later in the SNES game, they just make a beeline for you and try to trample you. I'll also add, for no particular reason, that this is my least favorite level in the entire game in both versions of it. There are parts of it that I just find kind of annoying, and I don't really like the music they use in it either. Inside the cave here, we get a nice little effect of lights poking through the ceiling in the arcade version, and this effect is missing from the Super Nintendo port. Another thing worth pointing out between these two versions is that the enemies are not placed the same. Again, it's because there's different numbers of them throughout the level in each version. And on the Super Nintendo version, there's a few enemy types with specific weapons that are just missing in that version as compared to the arcade one. They haven't cut out many, but the ones that are missing are pretty noticeable, as you'll see. I don't know why, but as short as this level is, it just feels like it's so much longer. Did I mention it's my least favorite level? Well, now you've heard that twice. And here's your chance to see those dinosaurs I was talking about before and the differences between the two versions. When we make our way through this next batch of enemies, we'll be at the boss fight, which, guess what, is completely different in each game. In the arcade, you face off against Cement Man. On the Super Nintendo, you get to fight Slash. Cement Man is definitely the more visually interesting of the two, but Slash was definitely the more well-known enemy at the time. I'll also note here that I'm playing the Super Nintendo game on its hardest difficulty level to make the experience more similar to the arcade version. Now Slash is super easy even on normal mode, but he's kind of a pain on hard. You can only damage him from behind. On difficulties below hard, you can just easily get behind him and bash away at him. On hard, he pretty much blocks all of your moves and he quickly turns around defending himself, preventing damage. So let's talk some visual differences during this fight. If you check out the cliffside in the background, it's way more detailed in the arcade game, while on the Super Nintendo it's a simple pattern-based affair. The ground tiles are also a little different in how they're arranged between the two versions. Alright, it won't be too much longer before Slash is taken care of, just bear with me here. And there we go.
Skull and Crossbones.
Here we are on Stage 6 on SNES, which is Stage 5 in the arcade game. The arcade has this neat little intro where we scroll in from the side of the ship. Once we begin, you'll also see that the ship is more detailed in the arcade version, especially on the mast. It also has a bunch of shadows and foreground elements that are just missing on the Super Nintendo. The old SNES makes up some ground by having some nice scrolling, sparkly water that gently bounces up and down in the background. Meanwhile, you'll see the water in the arcade background is completely motionless. Kind of a strange oversight, don't you think? I mean, yeah, it's the original, but we're supposed to be on a ship that's sailing. Still, on the Super Nintendo, it's just too bad about the lack of shadows and details. The ship itself on the SNES just looks extra plain without them. Almost more like something we'd expect to see on the NES in terms of simplicity. Now on Super Nintendo, we do get a ship that sails by in the background, that after lining itself up, starts firing a few giant cannonballs right at you. I think this was a nice little addition to the level that wasn't present in the arcade original, and props to Konami for thinking that up. The arcade game does have a few explosive boxes in this level that are missing from the Super Nintendo port. As with the other levels, in the arcade game the screen gets crowded with enemies at several points. The SNES throws a fair amount of them out on screen here, but it's obviously not up to the task of handling nearly as many sprites. Alright, at this point we've got another few groups of enemies to make it through in each version. We're going to clear out the Super Nintendo thugs first, and then we'll still have a few more to take care of in the arcade original. Gee, have I mentioned that the arcade game just throws tons and tons of enemies at you? And this will be an interesting boss fight comparison when we get to it, because the bosses are completely different. I won't spoil the surprise, you'll wait and see when they come along here. Alright, boss time! On SNES, we get Rocksteady and Bebop! I love the way they make their entrance by sliding down that banister. Rocksteady also looks particularly sharp in his pirate gear, and the way they interact with each other is really cool. In the arcade game, we fight Toka and Razar, who were bosses in that part of the SNES Technodrome level a couple of levels back. Now in the arcade game, we also have a rain and lightning storm going on while we contend with the bosses. This was completely eliminated from the SNES port. I have to say that Rocksteady and Bebop boss fight on SNES is probably the best, most interesting boss fight in the entire game. I love the way they get tangled up and bump into things and then at the end turn on each other and start attacking each other before they finally die. It was a shame that Rocksteady and Bebop weren't in the arcade Turtles in time, but I guess Konami felt we already saw them once in the original arcade game, and they wanted to throw in newer bosses, referencing later episodes of the show and the movies instead.
Bury my shell at Wounded Knee.
After a few levels with some pretty obvious cuts, things start out a bit more promising on the train level. The two games look extremely similar here. The biggest differences we'll see straight away are that the enemies have different weapons in the arcade game and there are, as usual, more of them. But other than that, at the start here, the SNES version looks really close to the arcade original. The background even scrolls by faster in the home version than it does in the arcade game. Now, things aren't going to stay quite so rosy, unfortunately. Coming up on the SNES port, we'll be going into another type of car on the train that has red walls with Foot Clan icons all over them. Now, it looks basically okay, just a little sparse. Keep in mind how this section looks for just a minute from now. As we continue on here and deal with the horde of normal scrub-level enemies foot soldiers, we'll run into these rock soldier guys whose name I can't remember. Just looked them up and it turns out they're called rock soldiers. Wow, how did I ever guess? Anyway, when you're dealing with the 3 rock soldiers on screen, you'll see that on the Super Nintendo version there's a little bit of flicker here and there. It mainly occurs when they brandish those I-beams and start swinging them at you. Okay, let's get back to that red background on the SNES. Remember that? We're about to approach the same type of area in the arcade game. And there it is. As we enter it from the start, we see a poster of a clown and a big clown ball. Once we move on a little bit, we see all sorts of circusy stuff in the background, none of which made its way into the SNES port. Which is too bad because it definitely adds to the atmosphere of the level. Also worth discussing here is the music. It's okay on SNES, but it doesn't really sound much like the instruments used in the arcade version. The arcade one uses a main instrument that much better suits the Old West theme. So yeah, clearly this is another one of those levels that you can get through just way faster on the SNES game than the arcade original. So here we're lagging behind a bit on the arcade game because there are so many more enemies to fight. And it's not just the enemies in this section, but it's the cumulative total of enemies that we face throughout the entire level. There are more here towards the end also, but this level is just way more populated in the arcade game. So needless to say, I've had to pause the SNES game to give us some time to catch up to the same spot in the arcade original. When we resume, we'll be up to our boss fight.
Ooh, I feel seasick.
Okay, boss fight. This time it's Leatherhead. In the cartoon, he was very Cajun sounding. For the arcade game, instead they went with just making him sound bad. Anyway, in the arcade game, Leatherhead is leaning on the back of the car with his arms folded, waiting for you to approach. When you do, he then says something that's completely missing from the Super Nintendo game. Or at least the voice sample is. On SNES, he comes running in backwards on all fours like an idiot. His pattern is quite a bit simpler and easier to deal with in the SNES game. In the arcade original, he's a bit more unpredictable, and he can hit you a lot more easily. The arcade version of this fight is kind of annoying BS, to be honest. On SNES, he's tougher than he is in, say, HyperStone Heist on Genesis, but to be fair, Leatherhead was the first boss in the Genesis game, so they did gimp him a bit in that version on purpose.
I'll also note here that when Leatherhead is defeated in the Super Nintendo game, he falls off the train dramatically. In the arcade game, he just falls over and dies.
Neon Knight Riders.
Here we are on Stage 8 on the Super Nintendo and Stage 7 in the arcade game. And wow, there's a pretty big difference between the two games here. In Arcade Turtles in Time, it's just another level standing on a hovering disc. On the SNES, it's sort of like a bonus round again, and they decided they just had to have a Mode 7 based level, so here it is. The arcade throws way more enemies at you here, and has a larger variety of them. I'll also take this opportunity to talk about the sampled voices in each game. The ones in the arcade are way clearer than the ones used on the SNES, which sound incredibly muffled. As I mentioned earlier, there are also considerably more voice samples used in the arcade original. Even though it doesn't particularly use a lot of them, it's just that the SNES really only uses a very select few of those samples and does away with the rest. On SNES, we of course get some crazy turns and direction changes on this section of lovely digital wallpaper. You don't steer or anything, and you don't have to jump over any of those gaps. You can just move around however you please at all times. I kinda wish Konami had went all in on this and made it so you actually had to steer, but that would have been really tough to implement with two players sharing one screen, I guess. Like the earlier sewer surfing level, this level ends by tallying up bonus points for enemies you killed and pizzas you picked up on SNES. Also in that version, we can clearly see the boss, Super Krang, slowly flying from the left side of the screen to the right in the background. Now we've got a little ways to go still in the arcade game here. Obviously, this level is a lot tougher in the arcade since the enemies don't die in one hit like they do in the Super Nintendo version, and there are so many more of them. But stay patient, we'll get there. And now we see our boss, Super Krang, in the background, and hey, his approach is a lot fancier in the arcade game, with scaling at the end, which leads us to the boss fight. As for this boss fight, it's another one that's considerably easier on SNES versus the arcade game. Old Super Krang also has a little more animation in the arcade game and is a little bit larger. In the arcade, he's got this really fun-looking chest-pounding animation that he does at the beginning and repeats at various points throughout, especially when he hits you with certain attacks. He's also more of a damage sponge in the arcade version, which, again, makes sense, since that one is designed for up to 4 players at once, while the SNES version was designed for 1 to 2 players. Once we defeat Super Krang here, we've only got one normal level left. Another thing that I should point out is there are other ports of the arcade version of Turtles in Time that exist, primarily on systems from the generation of the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox. You see, Turtles in Time was included as an unlockable in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Mutant Nightmare for those systems. And while the graphics look pretty good in that, they completely replaced the entire soundtrack and all the voice acting. And before you ask, yes, it sounds completely out of place. As annoying as that is, though, there was another sort of port/reboot of the game that came to the next generation of systems, which was Turtles in Time Reshelled. This one replaced all the graphics with 3D visuals, and once again replaced the entire soundtrack. Some people love this game. I'm not one of them. I think it looks and sounds god-awful, and I vastly prefer to play the arcade original. Go ahead and give me an angry comment.
Starbase, where no turtle has gone before.
Alright, here we are in our final normal level, the Starbase in the year 2100. Only a total nerd would notice that the tile that looks like a suitcase under the sign that says R-10 has bolts on it in the arcade game, but not the Super Nintendo port. So, yeah, I guess pretend I didn't notice that. Next up, we have kind of an oddity. In the arcade game, the background is full of large buildings and large domes and stuff like that. On the SNES version, we just get a planet or a moon or whatever with some tiny craters, no city, not even one little building. There are a few small domes, but they don't look anything like the arcade game. As the stage goes on, you'll see that Konami really packed this one full of enemies, which makes perfect sense for a climactic final level designed to relieve you of as many quarters as possible. It's not unusual to suffer an onslaught from 6 to 8 enemies here at once in the arcade, while things are a lot more tame in the SNES port. I'll also point out here that the yellow foot soldier enemies that throw discs behave quite a bit differently between the two games. On SNES, they just throw their discs in a straight line, and they hover there for a second before returning like a boomerang. In the arcade, the discs take this huge sweeping arc that includes a lot of vertical movement. This makes avoiding the disc when it's thrown in the arcade version a lot trickier than on the Super Nintendo. So really the trick here is, in the arcade version, to take those guys out as soon as they pop up on screen before they get a chance to throw their weapons. Here we'll see another look at those tiny little domes in the background of the Super Nintendo version. I'll note that one thing I'm a little bit surprised in is that the ROM hacking community hasn't made a hack to turn this game basically into the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game. Now, that would obviously be a huge undertaking, but man, the community has done some incredible stuff with a whole bunch of Super Nintendo games. So if anyone's looking for an interesting ROM hack to do, I say, hey, try and do that one. I think that would go over really well. Something else I'll point out here is that it's really kind of strange how few Konami arcade games were actually ported to the Super Nintendo, or the Genesis for that matter. It's a very surprisingly small amount when you look at the number of arcade games they made, including the huge number of 16-bit arcade games they made. You can tell Konami's focus was really on the home market, and I guess to their credit they picked up on trends that were changing in the market at the time. It's just too bad that we didn't get to see more of their stuff on capable systems like the Genesis and Super Nintendo. I won't make a cheap joke here about the arcade version's balls being a lot more aggressive than those on the SNES port. In fact, in the SNES game, you can slap the balls with your weapon to get them going away from you. Anyway, when we're all done with that nonsense, we just have to take out a few more foot soldier goons before we head on to this level's boss fight. While we've got another moment here, I'll just point out again how fantastic a job Konami did with the music in this game. It's just shocking how most other companies working on arcade ports to the Super Nintendo just could not do nearly as good a job on the sound as Konami did with this game and a few of the other arcade ports they did to the system. I'm looking at you, Capcom. Getting back on with things,
The boss fight for both versions of this game is regular old Krang in a tiny little spaceship. In the arcade game, Krang is a lot more aggressive and fires out this bubble attack that'll envelop you for a moment, and he does it often.
Now in the Super Nintendo version of the game, he does have the bubble attack, but as you can see during this fight, which again is on the hardest difficulty level, he hardly ever actually gets to do it. Now he will fire a few of them off before the end, so you will get a chance to look at it, but he never actually hit me with it.
On Super Nintendo, this fight's just a lot easier. Krang is easier to hit, and he has a simple, slower movement pattern for the first part of the fight. As you watch me fight him for a bit more here, let's take a look at that background. The floor pattern is a lot less detailed on SNES. The background tiles are also simpler and less varied in that version compared to the arcade original. As for the screen in the background, Shredder is a lot larger in the arcade than in the SNES version. And I'm not sure why Konami didn't throw in the extra tiles, unless this game really does take up most of the cartridge space. Anyway, let's finish this up. Krang's second attack form is once again simpler and more predictable on Super Nintendo. In the arcade game, he's faster and darts around the screen a lot more, making him much tougher to hit. Once we finally do manage to take out the annoying little brain-like thing, we're on to the game's final section and final boss. Can you guess who it is?
That holds our way home. Let's go! Technodrome, the final shell shock.
The final boss in each game is a variation of Shredder.
Turtle Soup, my
In arcade Turtles in Time, we fight regular old Shredder. In SNES Turtles in Time, we fight Super Shredder, as seen at the end of the second live-action TMNT movie from 1991. His attacks and patterns are a bit different between the two games because of this. As with pretty much all the boss fights, this one is much tougher in the original arcade game. Shredder has more moves in that version, is a lot more aggressive, and doesn't have the simple pattern he employs even in hard mode here on SNES. What's kind of funny is that in the arcade version, once you get the hang of the rhythm of attacking and dodging, Shredder isn't even all that tough. You basically just get right in front of him, but offset vertically a smidge, and then bash away at him real quick and run out of the way. Just rinse, repeat, and you'll eventually take him down. Now it does take a while because, as I've said a bunch of times now, this fight is really meant for up to 4 players to tackle at once. Things are more balanced for the SNES version, making the equivalent fight with Super Shredder much simpler and more predictable. Like the Metalhead fight, you can win just by getting behind him quickly and attacking over and over. Now I'll tell you fully what I think about both games just after the credits here, but I'll take the extra time I've got right now to say that I think most people who did not play the arcade game first will actually end up preferring the SNES version. It's not as hectic, but it works much better as a single-player or even a 2-player game than the arcade version does. The arcade game is still really good, it's just not well balanced for 1 or 2 players, leading to what many will probably find to be a frustrating experience. It's really more tailored to 3 or 4 players. Anyway, you can see that I was not kidding here. He goes down a lot faster and more easily on the Super Nintendo than he does in the arcade game. I've had that one paused for a minute or two at this point, and we've still got a little ways to go in taking out Turtles in Time Arcade regular Shredder. If you ask me, it seems a little strange that regular Shredder is way tougher to beat than Super Shredder. But here we are. Will wonders never cease? Alright, I've got to talk quick here because the ending is really short. The arcade has two scenes up front. A close-up of April, and we see the clouds and a blimp dropping the Statue of Liberty back into place. On SNES, it lingers longer on the first screen before going to the second, and that second screen looks way simpler on Super Nintendo, with very basic tiled flat clouds. Once we get to the close-up of the turtles riding on the blimp, we can see the whole thing is a lot wider on Super Nintendo, which once again is likely because they took the arcade graphics and ported them straight to the SNES for this part. Since the arcade game is higher res, they take up more horizontal space on the lower res SNES screen.
I guess one more thing I can't point out here is that if you look at the design of the blimp, particularly the section right above the turtle's head, we can see it's a little different between the two games, so Konami didn't rip all the graphics straight from the arcade and stick them onto the Super Nintendo. Some of this had to have been redrawn.
The credits themselves have a nice scaling effect for each letter in the arcade game. On SNES, the letters just slide around the screen with no scaling since, of course, it can't scale sprites without any extra hardware. Remember, Mode 7 only scales backgrounds, not sprites. Sprite scaling in games like Yoshi's Island required extra hardware like the Super FX2 chip. Anyway, on SNES, we also get an extra ending when completing the game on the hard level, which is what you're seeing now. Alright, so we're gonna be here for a little while we watch these credits on the Super Nintendo. This particular part stretches out for quite a bit. It's gonna run down a whole bunch of characters. We'll see each of the turtles get a little call out. We'll see the major characters like April and Splinter, and then we'll even go through all the regular enemies and then all the bosses. Now this is the reward you get for finishing the game on hard, or the hardest mode, whatever it's called, I don't remember. If you complete the game on any other level, in true Konami 16-bit fashion, you don't get the complete ending. Another thing I really prefer in the SNES version of the game is that you can actually turn off the back attacks. You see, by default, in the SNES version, and even in HyperStone Heist, and in the arcade original, if you have an enemy that sneaks up on you from behind and is really close to you, you'll automatically do a back attack. And while this is great in theory, it's kind of annoying when you have a bunch of enemies in front of you that you're in the middle of attacking, especially if you're getting ready to finish a combo off. So in both Turtles in Time on SNES and HyperStone Heist on Genesis, you can go into the options menu and turn off that back attack, which I normally do when playing those games. And hey, this game credits the Rock Soldiers as Stone Warriors. They are known by many names. So I guess I've kind of run out of things to say about this game at this point. We've still got some time to kill though, so what can we talk about? I don't know, let's talk about the NES port of the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game. It's so-so. It doesn't really play anything like the arcade game. It looks nice for an NES title, and it plays alright, but it's so scaled back and simple that it's really just kind of a shell of the arcade game, and I did not mean that pun. I'm just winging this section here. I didn't write this part out in advance, so forgive me for that one. And I guess I can't be trusted to wing it without throwing puns out there, so I'm gonna go ahead and shut up now. I'll be back as soon as the ending is fully complete to give you my final thoughts on the games and tell you which one I think is better and why. Or if one is better than the other. Which is it? You'll just have to keep watching to find out. Anyway, once we run through the rest of the normal enemies and then bosses, we get a final scene with Splinter and the 4 turtles, in which Splinter tells you how great you are. Okay, it's time to wrap this up.
Okay, so brass tacks. Which version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Turtles in Time is the best? If we're talking about graphics and sound, well, the arcade version wins hands down. It's got way more animation, way more going on screen, and the music is a little higher quality. If we're talking gameplay though, I've gotta say, if you're just playing 1 or 2 players, I think the Super Nintendo version with its refined mechanics plays much better than the arcade game. So in the end, it's really kind of a wash. Really what I'd suggest is if you're going to play solo, stick to the Super Nintendo version. If you want to have a nice 3 or 4 player experience, well, the arcade game's your only choice. So what about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the HyperStone Heist for the Sega Genesis? Well, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I would put it a notch below both the arcade and Super Nintendo ports of Turtles in Time. It's still a great game, it's just that the new areas they added are kind of bland compared to the existing ones that were there, and I would say that while the gameplay's a little more refined, the graphics are a little less refined, and the music is just slightly rougher, even though it's still fantastic for the system. Now, it's great that it exists and you can have a slightly different experience on both of the 2 major home 16-bit consoles. So I'm glad they made it. I just wish they would have tweaked it a little bit, because the Genesis could have definitely handled slightly better than it got. Alright, dear viewers, what about you? What's your favorite Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles brawling game? Is it Turtles in Time, HyperStone Heist, the original arcade game? Tell me all about it in the comments. Or tell me if you're one of those weirdos that actually likes Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time reshelled. Nah, I'm just kidding. But that game does suck. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please toss it a like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another video. And if you're so inclined, you can now support me on either Patreon or Ko-fi. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.